Dealing with item 7C, our county comments on Bill 108. Randy, is it Randy and Scott? Okay, Scott's starting us. I'm going to look for a motion, please, to put the item on the table. Moved by Councillor Desai, seconded by Councillor Mackey.
Okay.
Scott?
Great, thanks Warden Hicks and members of council. Good afternoon. It feels like a bit of deja vu up here in terms of saying, well, we're here to present some legislative changes with a very tight turnaround time
Yes.
that are amending a number of different acts, but we'll get on with it. This was another team effort. I'd like to thank Michael, Kevin, Pat, and our entire planning staff for contributing towards this report. Because of the breadth of the report, it was difficult for any one person to review.
Yeah.
I'm going to go over some of the changes to the Planning Act and the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal Act, and Randy and Hibba will cover some of the other acts that are being changed. One of the things that's common amongst all is that there are some significant changes. Some we see as positive changes, and some maybe a little bit more challenging. At this stage, based on the amount of information available and the tight turnaround time to submit comments, it really has been tough to provide comprehensive analysis of what this means. In some cases, it would be desirable to see the proposed regulations to these legislative changes. So in general, staff are recommending that the province maybe pause this process just a bit to release more information and have a more robust consultation period. But beyond that, we'll get on with the changes to the Planning Act. They are looking at some proposed changes to second units, both in dwellings and in accessory buildings, which are generally positive in terms of allowing landowners to have a second unit both in their house and possibly in the garage or accessory building. It used to be that the previous legislative changes or previous legislation said you picked one or the other. They are looking at some changes to inclusionary zoning, and for those that are maybe newer to council and aren't familiar with the term inclusionary zoning, it's a tool that the province introduced a few years ago, which has been used in the States for a number of years, which would allow municipalities where they have policies in their official plan and their zoning bylaw to require a certain percentage of affordable units in housing developments that are 10 units or more. So let's just say you had a new housing development coming in for 100 units. If you'd done the necessary policy background work, you could require through agreement with that developer that say 15% of those units come in at an affordable price. Under the current system, it is administratively heavy because not only do you need to make sure that those units are affordable when they're first built and sold, but there's an agreement that's needed with the municipality to make sure that those units stay affordable for X number of years. Otherwise, you'd find yourself in a situation where the first buyer just snaps up the affordable units and flips them for a much higher price. So the changes that the province is looking at here would be to take away some of the municipal discretion on when inclusionary zoning can be used, and it would only be used where municipalities prescribed to use it, or else where you're looking at zoning around a major transit station, so a subway station, a GO station, or where you have a development permit system in place. County staff are recommending that the province keep the inclusionary zoning process as is. Although we haven't implemented inclusionary zoning in any part of Grey County just yet, we believe there should be municipal autonomy on where it could be appropriate for your own communities. Another one of the key changes to the Planning Act is they're looking at reducing the timeframes that are the minimum timeframes that municipalities have to process applications. So for new official plans or official plan amendments, a decision has to be rendered currently within 210 days. The proposed reduction is going down to 120 days. For plans of subdivision, it's going from 180 days to 120 days. And for zoning, it's going down to 90 days unless there's an associated official plan amendment. It's tough to know what impact this proposed change will have at this stage. I can say that it is difficult to get through a comprehensive official plan amendment in 120 days. If we think of some of our bigger amendments, like complicated gravel pits, if you will, there's simply processes that take some time in terms of advertising for the public meeting, reviewing the reports, and ultimately getting motions out of both municipal and county councils. Boy, the clock kicks down in a hurry there when you have that. I would note this would apply to the approval of new official plans as well. So if we take our current recolor gray official plan, which was put before the province in late October, early November of 2018, and we now have draft modifications in May of 2019, that's about a 6-month time frame right there, and we're not to the decision yet. And we don't say that in any way to slander the provincial staff. They've been great to work with, and they've been moving expeditiously on that. But it does take some time. So if the province makes this change, we're going to need to sit down between county and municipal staff and also agency staff like conservation authorities and utilities to really look at sharpening our processes and to try to determine how we can do so more efficiently. I will say that these are the minimum time frames. In Grey County, our development community is generally very good to work with, and we find typically, as long as they see that the county and municipal staff are moving forward with their application, they don't appeal at the very first opportunity. It's in their best interest to work with staff and council to try to come up with a decision that works for everybody, but these legislative changes would mean that, should they wish to, they could appeal much earlier than expected. We've also recommended that the province consider allowing municipalities to pause those timeframes where they had an agreement with the developer that additional work was needed. So if we received an application in the summer of 2019 and we determined through the technical review that additional spring environmental work was done, we'd be through our 120 days before we ever got to that spring season to do that work. So maybe where the developer and the municipality and the county agreed, we could hit a pause on that processing time frame to facilitate some of those future works. Another one of the changes that affects both the Planning Act and the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal Act is they're looking at a broader range of reasons for which someone can appeal a development or a policy. Right now with the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, you can only appeal where there's a consistency issue with the provincial policy statement or a conformity issue with an official plan or a provincial plan, and those were changes that were implemented through the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal. With these new changes, potential appellants would be able to appeal beyond just those tests where they thought something was bad planning, so to speak, provided they provided specific rationale for their decisions. Staff see pros and cons to this. Certainly it could result in more appeals, but on the other hand, under the current LPAT system, there were some appeals that were being declared invalid simply because people didn't put the sort of key words in their appeal letter that it would take, in some cases, a lawyer or professional planner to include in there. The province is also looking at limiting third-party appeals on official plans and official plan amendment non-decisions. So basically only a county, a municipality, or a proponent could appeal those non-decisions. Although that is a change that's very similar to the way it's played out in practice in staff's experience under the current system. So that no big issues there. Perhaps the biggest change to the Planning Act piece, which also affects the development charges piece, which Randy will be speaking to in a few moments, is what's called the community benefit charges. And from a planning perspective, the community benefit charges would be fees that municipalities could impose that would replace elements of development charges, but also replace the current bonusing system. So for those of you that may not be aware of bonusing, under the Planning Act currently, municipalities can authorize increases in height or density in exchange for public benefit. So that public benefit could be, additional public space. It could be things like affordable housing. And in that case, a developer might be authorized to go up an extra story in terms of their height or to allow for increased density. The proposed changes through Bill 108 would do away with bonusing and would implement this community benefit charge, which would be used in part in its place, but it would also be used to replace some of those soft services, if you will, like libraries or daycares, that would otherwise be collected through your municipal development charges. The other big change through these community benefit charges is that they would also, in some cases, replace parkland dedication. So municipalities would be forced at the plan of subdivision level to decide whether or not they wanted parkland or cash in lieu of parkland, or whether or not they wanted to collect these community benefit charges. So essentially you're saying, you know, do we want libraries or daycares, or do we want more park space? We can't have both, as is the case with the current system. There's also some bits about the community benefit charges that we simply don't quite understand yet. There's wording in the proposed legislative changes that would say that municipalities have to have a special account for such charges, which makes sense, but that 60% of those monies each year need to be either spent or allocated. So we will require more details on exactly what that means, and particularly with respect to the allocation. You know, if we set aside some of those community benefit charge monies for a larger future project, does that count in terms of hitting that 60% target each year? So in general, we'd be seeking some additional information here to determine exactly how it would impact both counties and municipalities. I should note that currently bonusing is only available to municipalities. It's not available to the counties, but development charges are of course available at both the county and municipal level. One of the other key changes from a planning perspective is the province has announced that there would no longer be any public appeals on plans of subdivision. So if your neighbor was proposing a plan of subdivision beside you, you could still go to the public meeting and submit your written comments and everything else. But if council made a decision that you weren't happy with, there would no longer be any right to appeal. You know, the rationale for this decision appears to be that the province wants to speed up the process and bring new housing online earlier, which, you know, that's you know, generally a valid reason. Staff have concerns that that it may limit public involvement in the process, or that it may mean people simply appeal the associated rezoning instead of plan of subdivision. And in that case, it might not speed up the process. So staff are recommending some tweaks to this if the province does want to go down that road, to maybe look at how those implementing zoning amendments get processed as well. In general, I would say at least 9 out of 10 subdivisions that we process in the county require some sort of implementing rezoning, which the way the current legislation reads, you could still appeal. With respect to the proposed local planning appeal tribunal changes, for those that may or may not be aware, the LPAT, as it's referred to, came in 2017 to replace the Ontario Municipal Board, and it was a radical change at the time. LPAT is really still just finding its feet. There's still a number of appeals that are being processed under the old OMB system, just based on the date when they're appealed. So we really haven't been involved with too many files just yet that are a true test of this new LPAT system. We've recommended what the province might find advantageous is to put a pause on this one, maybe give LPAT another year to start to find its feet and see how the system actually works before they do this comprehensive review. However, it is worth just flagging some of the changes that they are looking at. The new system would be, if you'd like, a hybrid of the current LPAT system and OMB model. The province is bringing back what's called de novo hearings. So under the old OMB model, when you'd go to a hearing, it would be almost as though the local council process had never happened. People would get to present their cases either for or against a development or policy. You'd go through a series of examination of evidence and cross-examination, and then the board would ultimately make a decision. They were supposed to have regard for a municipal council's decision, but they didn't have to side with the municipal council in that regard. Under the current LPAT system, the LPAT has provided a detailed written record of all the evidence that's been prepared to date in terms of all the evidence that was provided prior to municipal council making a decision, and then the tribunal decides what they want to hear more evidence on. So they can decide whether or not any further witnesses are needed, or whether or not they can make a decision based on the current model. So the new system would go back to that, start a fresh model. It might mean less regard for municipal council decisions. It'll certainly mean longer hearings and potentially more costly hearings. So there's certainly pros and cons in that regard. One of the other potentially positive changes that they're looking at through the Bill 108 here is requiring mandatory mediation for appeals in some cases. Under the current system, mediation is only an option when all parties consent. If we want to roll up our sleeves to work together, we can only do so when everybody's there, kind of thing. In this case, the tribunal could press people's hand to force that. Doesn't mean you're going to come to a mediated settlement, but at least keeps that door open. They're also looking at changes which mean that which mean that participants to a hearing, so those that want to give some input but don't want the full party status, can only participate in writing, and they won't be at the hearing making verbal statements, which still gives them a chance to participate but limits the time frame for a hearing. The LPAT is also being proposed to change from the current tests of consistency to the PPS and conformity to official plans and provincial plans back to the old OMB test of, is this good planning or not? So the tribunal doesn't need to make a decision which is 100% conforming to the current official plan if it's determined that the decision is considered to be good planning. There's certainly some benefits there. It can mean for more compromises, and it could lead to a wider array of decisions, but under the current system, it is a very narrow scope on what the tribunal can make decisions on. And the other changes that they're looking at would be to this isn't directly through Bill 108, but increase the monies available to LPAT to try to clear some of the queue of existing appeals and hearings. Just for your information, a few weeks ago, the county just booked a hearing for July 2020. And so that's a 10-day hearing at that stage, and it could be 6 or 8 months after that hearing's done before we get a decision. So it's very tough to say to a developer that appealed in 2018 that you might have your decision in late 2020 or 2021. So certainly additional money there to help with more adjudicators could be a good thing. The final comment that staff would raise on the LPAT changes are just, if they are going to make the changes, what do the transition provisions look like? As I said, currently we have a number of appeals in the system that are being processed under the OMB system. We could end up with appeals being processed under LPAT 1.0 and then this third version of LPAT 2.0. So it could get quite confusing to both members of the public, counties and municipalities, as well as the adjudicators themselves on exactly what ground rules they're playing with. So some clarity in how those are being processed and the ability not for new appeals to jump the queue, if you will, would certainly be great in terms of the implementing regulations in that regard. With that, I'll turn it over to Randy for his bids.
That's the Planning Act and LPAT Act changes. There's also proposed changes to the Development Charge Act, as Scott indicated. And there are 3 key changes that are being proposed to the Development Charges Act, including secondary suites, soft services, and administrative matters. So for secondary suites, what they're proposing is that the Development Charge Act would exempt the creation of secondary suites in new residential buildings from DCs, including ancillary dwellings or detached structures. The classes of residential buildings will be eligible for this exemption will be prescribed in future regulations, so we're not sure exactly what will be included in those. But what it's pointing to is that it'll be more exemptions for secondary units. So from a staff perspective, secondary suites are a good opportunity for homeowners to collect rent money to offset some of their housing costs. Secondary suites will also help to address the shortage of affordable housing throughout the county. The Grey County's current development charge bylaw already exempts secondary units within and attached to existing residential dwellings, and Council has also supported in principle revisions to the development charge bylaw that would further exempt secondary units within detached buildings and new structures. So actually this aligns really well with what Council has already supported in principle for those changes. County staff therefore recommend we support the proposed DC exemptions for secondary units. The second category of change in the Development Charge Act is the treatment of soft services. As Scott indicated earlier, the province is proposing to replace bonusing provisions under the Planning Act with this new community benefit charge. And this new CBC, we'll call it, would replace what are called discounted services or soft services from the Development Charge Act, and therefore only hard services would be eligible for collection through development charges. This would include roads, water, wastewater, like sewer, stormwater, transit, waste diversion, and policing and fire. So anything that we currently have in our DC bylaws that we're collecting outside of those eligible services would no longer be eligible to be collected through development charges. They are proposing transition provisions, but again, the details will be in the regulations in terms of when the cutoff date, so to speak, would be in terms of when we'd be able to collect still on those soft services. And what Scott indicated is that they're proposing to replace these soft services with this new community benefit charge. But again, as Scott indicated, there's not a lot of detail yet in terms of what will be eligible, how we'll be able to collect that, who can collect it. Right now, it seems that the county and municipality can collect it, but there's only certain parameters that you can collect it under. There's also, as Scott indicated, a cap in terms of CBCs, so we're not sure what that cap will be. And we're also not sure in terms of the details about having to spend 60% of what you collect in the following year. So we still require further details about that CBC in order to determine whether or not it's actually going to be an equal replacement of what we currently have under the Development Charges Act for collecting of soft services. So that's still to stay tuned, I guess, and hopefully we'll get some more detail once the regulations are released. The third area change is administration. And there are proposed changes to when development charge rates would be calculated. Currently, development charge rates are determined at the time when the first building permit is issued. And the proposed changes to the Act would freeze development charge rates earlier on in the development process. So for example, when an application is made for a site plan or a zoning amendment, the DC rate would be frozen at the time that application is received. Development charge would continue to be paid at the time of building permit issuance. However, the DC rate could be lower than what would normally be collected. Municipalities are able to charge interest from the time the DC rate has been frozen until the time of DC payment. There are also proposed changes to the development charges regarding rental housing, institutional, industrial, commercial, and nonprofit housing developments. And for these type of developments, what they're proposing is that the development charges would be paid in 6 annual installments, with the first installment starting at either issuance of occupancy permit or the date the building is first occupied, whichever one is earlier. So municipalities will be able to again charge interest from the time of building permit to time of occupancy with a maximum amount prescribed, and that will be prescribed through regulations. What we're recommending is that we're hoping that the prescribed rate would be tied to some sort of cost of living or indexing price that's consistent across the board and would actually capture the true inflation costs associated with what we're seeing on the ground. Any front-ending deferral payment agreements reached prior to the Act coming into force will be preserved. So that's one bonus, that those current deferral agreements would not be affected by these changes. Based on these changes, what this likely means is that there will be less development charge revenue collected. By freezing DC rates at time of application submission, it does provide developers with greater certainty as to what DC they will be paying at time of building permit. But as I mentioned, it's likely going to mean that municipalities in the county will be collecting less DC revenue through development charges. Another concern we have is with respect to tracking these different rates to be paid, as some developments do not require a site plan or zoning amendment, and therefore there will be different DC rates that will need to be tracked for each development. Currently, the county DCs are collected by local municipalities, and therefore if these proposed Act changes were approved, the county would work with local municipalities on determining the best way to track and monitor these different DC rates. But what it could require is some sort of technology IT solution in order to help track these different rates, because it could be quite cumbersome to determine what DC rate is actually being paid out at time of building permit or at time of occupancy permit. For those that are being changed to the time of occupancy, if an occupancy permit is issued, that's okay, because then that's the trigger. But if an occupancy permit in some cases is not always required, and so therefore the way the Act's written is that the building owner is responsible for letting the municipality know when that building is occupied within 5 business days. So again, it's the questions of who's going to track that. Is this going to add more administration costs? Who's going to enforce that if a building owner is not letting municipalities know that they've now occupied that building? So there's things like that where some of the changes may make sense and provides greater certainty for the development community. On the administration side, we think it's going to add some more costs in terms of tracking and enforcing some of these different changes. And ultimately, like I said, will result in what we're thinking will be less development charge revenue collected unless this community benefit charge is an equal comparison, which the details aren't there yet. So that's on the Development Charge Act side. There are also proposed changes to the Environmental Assessment Act. And basically what the province is proposing to do is increase the exemptions for low-risk activities within the municipal class EA process. These include things such as installing speed bumps, de-icing, streetscaping. So county staff overall support exempting low-risk activities within the municipal class EA process. Again, it speeds up those projects and would help reduce overall costs, so we're in favor of that approach. There is also proposed changes to the Endangered Species Act change, but we already addressed those at the last committee of the whole meeting, and there's nothing new to report on that. We've reviewed that, so our comments from the May 9th committee of the whole meeting would just stand, so to speak. There are also proposed changes to the Conservation Authority Act in this Bill 108. Again, for the most part, the proposed changes are consistent with what we identified in the staff report back on May 9th. Further detail has been provided with these changes, including the proposed change regarding what's called non-mandatory services. And municipalities will need to enter into agreements with conservation authorities in order for conservation authorities to continue to provide those non-mandatory services. What we think this could lead to is an inconsistent delivery of programs and services throughout the watershed, as some municipalities may choose to opt in for certain programs and services, while others may not. And for those that opt in, the cost to continue those programs and services could increase if not all municipalities were opting in. What we think this could lead to is a reduction in programs and services being offered by conservation authorities, as they may not have that collective mass in order to continue to offer certain programs and services. What we've indicated is that this requires a coordinated response and determination for what programs and services municipalities will want conservation authorities to continue to provide beyond those core mandated services, in order to ensure that majority of municipalities are at least opting into those key services that municipalities and counties want conservation authorities to continue to provide. Overall, before we get into that, Hiba's going to talk about the Ontario Heritage Act fairly quickly, and then I'll wrap it up.
One of the last acts that the province is proposing to change is the Ontario Heritage Act, and the main amendment in this act includes providing property owners with the ability to object to being placed on the municipal heritage registry or having their properties designated. So now property owners will have the right to provide notice of objections to municipal councils on whether their property should be designated, and further they would have the right to appeal their council decisions to the LPAT. Overall, staff response to this change has been positive. We acknowledge that providing property owners with the ability to object gives more transparency to the process and gives property owners the ability to voice concerns. In just saying that, speaking to municipal planners, they don't see this objection occurring often. Municipal planners often take extensive consultations with property owners before placing them on the registry. So we are appreciative and support property rights or appeal rights to property owners, but we don't foresee these being used often. We're happy to take any questions on any of the acts.
And just further to what Scott indicated at the beginning of the presentation, based on the nature of these changes, so we've just hit the ones that we think will impact the county the most, but there's 15 pieces of legislation that's being changed under Bill 108. So based on the nature of those, based on what you've heard, is that there's some positive as well as some negative impacts as a result of these proposed changes. The province should consider a more robust consultation for these. They're asking for comments by June 1st. It was released on May 2nd, the bill. The short time frame just doesn't give municipalities and other stakeholders much time to respond, to ask questions, or to consult. And even last night we received from MFOA their detailed response on Bill 108. So we're learning more and more information every day. And it's just a result of these short time frames. It's really difficult to digest a lot of these things and provide really fulsome comments back. We've done our best based on the proposed legislation, in this report, but we're just recommending again that they extend this by at least 90 days in order to give more time for municipalities to really provide some wholesome comments back to the province. Other than that, as Hiba indicated, we're more than happy to take any questions from council.
Councillor Bartnicki?
Thank you, Mr. Warden. I have one question about the CBCs versus development charges. Development charges prescribe a percentage for each of the soft services, and I think you used libraries as an example. Am I correct to understand that CBCs will not prescribe and will be negotiable between county or municipality and the developer?
Through you, Mr. Warden, and that's where I think the details are still a little bit light. We anticipate that those details will be provided through regulation. It does appear that there is some flexibility there based on the proposed legislation, but the examples they provide are libraries, daycare facilities at this stage. So we're not sure if it'll be more than that. Right now, under the county's development charge bylaw, what we would consider the soft services, which would no longer be eligible under the proposed changes. These include things like paramedic services, provincial offenses, trails, growth-related studies, and growth-related capital costs associated with the Graber's Health Unit are items that we're capturing right now under our current DC bylaw that would fall under the category of those soft services, which would then no longer be eligible for collection. For the county's perspective, 91% of our DC charge is roads related. So it will have less of an impact for the county compared to other municipalities, but still 9% of what we could have collected through DCs would not be eligible, potentially, unless the community benefit charge is a direct replacement of that. And that's where the details, we just don't have those yet, and we think that should come out through the regulations. And again, we're hoping that there will be enough time once those regulations are released to be able to provide some good constructive comments and feedback to the province.
Thanks, Randy. You mentioned in the DC charges that secondary standalone suites, we are going, or you're recommending that we take the DC charges away from that. When would you expect that bylaw to come forth?
Yeah, so if there's no more legislation proposed changes, we can tackle some of these things. But we were hoping and targeting June 13th, committee of the whole, to bring that forward. In light of these proposed changes, it may delay a little bit, just to make sure that we're in alignment with whatever is being proposed to the Changes to the Development Charges Act. So we just need to double check to make sure that it is in alignment. From what we're seeing right now, what we are proposing previously would not be impacted by what the proposed changes are. So we still plan on bringing that forward. So we're hoping June for sure.
Thank you.
Councillor Desai?
Thank you, Mr. Warden. One of the more concerning issues that has come up is the new proposed timelines around the process on planning documents. My question for you to staff is, assuming that the government does decide that they're going to power through with this bill and they're going to bring into effect the shortened timelines, do we have the resources to meet those new timelines without really affecting our budget for this year anyway?
You, Mr. Warden. It's really tough to say at this stage, and that's, it seems like a bit of a cop-out, but it is tough to say. What Scott indicated is that we were planning on looking at the overall process anyways, but this just gives us another incentive, I guess, in order to consider that. So we want to work with developers, local municipalities, other agencies to see if there's opportunities where we can create some efficiencies through our existing processes. But yeah, it may require some innovative thinking in terms of looking at how we can do that. We are working with, prior to all this, we've been working with our IT staff on developing what we're calling a planning application tracking system. We think that this will provide some efficiencies as well in our process, as well as help communicate out to developers and to the public this current status of these applications. ultimately, I think that's where, all communication to all parties involved in a process will help go a long way in terms of preventing appeals, even if we are going over the 120 days as proposed. And so some of the suggestions we put forward in terms of putting a freeze, because what we're seeing is that for the most part, we might be able to, on average basis, be able to achieve the 120 days, but there's times where it just doesn't happen because more information is required. And so if we all agree that we just can put a freeze on it and enter into some sort of easy agreement, so to speak, a simple agreement, then hopefully we're not being faced with more challenges or appeals to the LPAD. So, but at this stage, from a staff resource perspective, it's tough to say.
Councillor Desai?
I was just going to add, I wanted you to speak to the planning tracking system, and I think for council's benefit, just having that information and seeing how many different applications are in process and where they are in that process, when it comes time to make decisions about resources, you're going to have some data to be able to look at. And I think for you folks, there's just so much going on all the time. It's great to have a way to kind of step back and see, this is really the sum total of everything that we're trying to deal with.
We're really close on that. We've done some testing with IT staff on that, just to test how it's going to work. IT is working on tweaking that, so we hope to roll out that solution in the next couple of months, so we can start utilizing it internally. And then there's the public-facing part in terms of reporting out, in terms of where we're at with the process. So we hope that will help, because it's built-in email notifications to staff saying this is now due and it's ready to go, or here's comments that were received from, say, internal departments, and notifying through email that we've received those comments, and everything's tracked in one area. So we're pretty excited about it.
Councillor Desai?
The other issue that I had was with the inclusionary zoning, and I believe what the bill says is that if the municipality already prescribes to it in their official plan, they can go ahead with it. My question was, can a municipality going forward prescribe to their official plan and be treated the same way, or is this June 1st? If you don't have it by then, you don't have it. In addition to that question is, I know it mentions transit systems and development permit systems. What about in areas that have a higher density of employment opportunities?
Yeah, and that's where right now the way the proposed changes would be is we think it would impact municipalities' ability to implement inclusionary zoning, especially in I think municipalities like Grey County. So unless you're a prescribed municipality, or unless you are proposing inclusionary zoning around a major transit area, which I'm assuming more applies to GTA, or unless you have a development permit system, then it looks like you'll be very limited in terms of your ability to implement inclusionary zoning, if that municipality is interested in doing that. So I think part of it is that the province seems to be really pushing the development permit system, and there's pros and cons to all systems, of course, but for those that are not aware, a development permit system basically is combining your zoning, site plan, and minor variance process into one process. Some municipalities have been testing that process. We're hearing some pros and cons in terms of how it can work. So that's something that I think the province is really pushing municipalities to look at, is if you want to have inclusionary zoning, you have to implement this system. And I think that's one way they're trying to tackle that. So really, it looks like it's going to be very limited in terms of who can implement inclusionary zoning.
Councillor McQueen, did you have a question?
I do have
You've got another, okay.
Thank you. My final question is with regards to the CBCs. One of the rationales that the government has provided in their wording was around the fact that bonusing is not as transparent as they would like it to be. In our correspondence back to them, do we have any ideas on how we can make that more transparent? And I mean, planning is not my strong suit, I'll admit, but one of the things that I thought of was, I was on a run, Millen, come on.
Let me stop you. Not like we've been here all day.
Pardon? Can you say it into the mic? Yeah, 2 minutes for interrupt. No. Red card. I should break those. Maybe through a zoning bylaw mapping system where we can identify areas where we would like to see some, bonusing activity taking place. Is that something we can do in sending correspondence back?
Yeah, I think there definitely are best practices for making sure that your bonusing provisions are as transparent as possible. And I think, including policies in your official plan and including, identifying specific areas if you're really targeting bonusing in specific areas and being consistent and showing those through your zoning bylaw. Those are all great ways that we think it just adds further transparency and provides greater certainty than developers when they are doing their pro formas to say, oh yes, there is an opportunity for bonusing here, and here's the guidelines or here's the policies that I'll be operating under in order to be able to qualify for that bonusing. So I think that's where it'd be, if they take our recommendation to keep bonusing in place, looking for those best practices, I think, is the way to go.
McLean.
Quickly, I just, Councillor Mackey brought up the issue around DC charges and secondary dwellings that are detached. We actually, in conversation with one of our building officials, we had a conversation to say, do you just need clarity? And we, as council, the Greyhounds, provided clarity to that definition of what detached in charge. So now we've added clarity, so we're not opening up our DC charge, added clarity, and we have one that we have to refund back, and we can move forward. So I don't know if that's an option for the county, but it came from council through a resolution and added clarity to what the interpretation of the DC charge on secondary dwellings was in the intent of charging a DC charge on detached units.
Yeah, right now it'd be clarifying some wording in our current bylaw. That one's a simple change. Some of the other changes are a bit more complex that we're proposing, but that one's a simple change of just adding a couple words or changing some words.
We didn't go back and we just added clarity through resolutions.
Okay, let's call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Thank you very much. I think we need to stand up. Don't leave. Just stand. Yeah.
You taking a picture when our feet are in the air?
Okay, you're happy to have this one up, I bet. Three-color gray. Can I get a mover to put the item on the floor? Councillor Bartnicki, seconded by Councillor Robinson.
Thank you.
You're up.
And yes, this is exciting news as it's one step closer to having our county, our new official plan for the county approved by the province. So the province recently sent correspondence which included a chart of draft modifications that the ministry is proposing. So attached to the report is a copy of the letter that was sent by the ministry as well as that draft modifications chart. Ministry staff are asking for comments by May 24th, so there's a quick turnaround time. So I'm going to be seeing one of them tomorrow at the County Planning Directors Conference, so I'll be able to hand them to him in person if this gets passed. But I won't go through the proposed modifications in detail, but we'll highlight some of the proposed mods. And if you have any specific questions about those, we're more than happy to answer those. So we've reviewed them, and generally we have no objections to the proposed changes. There's a total of 21 modifications, and I think 5 of those are modifications that staff have recommended just based on some errors and omissions that we've identified post-adoption.
Right.
County staff have recommended some minor wording changes to some of the proposed modifications, just to add some further clarity, and we've discussed these already with ministry staff last week, and they are in general agreement with the comments and suggested edits that we've put forward. We're also recommending revising Appendix E. So council may recall, Appendix E identifies what's called the bedrock and shale resource areas. And as you note in the proposed changes that the province is putting forward, they're proposing some changes to be more consistent with the provincial policy statement language for these areas. So we took a quick scan of that mapping again, and we noticed that there were still some settlement areas that overlap that mapping The intent was to remove any of those areas that overlap with settlement areas. So we're recommending that Appendix E be replaced with a couple minor revisions to that mapping. With respect to the proposed mods, the province has made some wording changes for these resources, like I said, to be consistent with the PPS. In that proposed development within these resources, it would be permitted if it could be demonstrated that the use of the bedrock and shale resources is not feasible, or that the development serves a greater public interest, and that issues of public health and safety and environment impacts are addressed. Previously, we had raised concerns about the lack of consultation on this mapping and the potential impacts it may have. However, in order to be consistent with the PPS, the province needs to modify this wording for this policy. These areas are primarily located in the north end of the county and are located outside of settlement areas and outside of the Niagara Escarpment Plain area. And these policies would only be triggered if there was a Planning Act application proposed within those areas. So what we'll do is we'll develop some implementation guidelines for how these policies would be implemented, just based on the providing more information again to the development community and to others about what these policies would actually entail. There are some proposed changes that would delete some text, and we're recommending that some of that text be kept in, as we just feel it adds further clarity. Our whole intent with Recolor Gray was try to make it as user-friendly as possible. So we're recommending that some of that text be kept in because it provides description on how these policies will be interpreted. All the comments from county staff can be found in that mod chart. And majority of these comments, as I note, indicate no concerns. We've proposed some suggested modifications. Those include changes to Schedule C. There was a couple of minor changes that we made. Again, there was some areas that we noticed that were overlapping our settlement areas. That, again, was not the intent. And there was some further mapping revisions that we received from Grace Sobel that resulted in a linkage change east of Maxwell. And it's only a slight alteration that we're proposing there. There's some revisions to hazard lands in Big Bay. There's also some parcel mapping in the Ayton secondary schedule that we've replaced based on a landowner concern. We also identified post-adoption that, because we updated the hazard land mapping with Conservation Authority's latest mapping, and in the industrial business park in West Gray, we noticed that when we were, based on the hazard land changes, we missed a piece to be designated industrial business park. So we've asked the province to include that back in, which they've done. And we also made some recommended minor wording changes to clarify institutional uses and agricultural designations. So county staff overall, we're very appreciative of the province's inclusion of the county staff's recommended modifications. It'll save us having to address these through a future housekeeping amendment, so we're greatly appreciative of that. Once the province has approved the official plan, the decision is final, and the province's decision can no longer be appealed based on the most recent changes to the Planning Act. So at this stage, what we're recommending is that the comments be provided to the province. And given the due date for comments, it's recommended that staff proceed with sharing these comments prior to the formal adoption by council. And be happy to take any questions.
Good. Questions, anyone? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? That's carried. Thank you very much, Randy.
Thank you very much.
Anne Marie, you're up next. Community Housing Renewal Strategy. Item 7F. I need a mover, please. Councillor Dobreen, seconded by Councillor Boddy. You're on.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. So Grey County Housing has a 10-year housing and homelessness plan, as you are aware. And each year we provide an update on what we have done from the previous year. The plan first started in 2014, in April of 2014. And each year we come to council and outline what the initiatives have that we have done in Grey County Housing and some of the progress that we're making towards our 10-year plan. I have provided a link in the document to the 10-year plan. It is on our website. So the plan and the services and the initiatives that we have are used in order for us to provide services for families for seniors, for youth, singles, people with disabilities, working poor. So really it's looking at some of our most vulnerable people that live in Grey County. This report just gives a little bit of a highlight on some of the things that we have been working on over the past year. I won't go through them all because I know they're listed in your report, but just some of them that we wanted to highlight are the Owen Sound Housing Company has 36 units of affordable housing being completed in 2018-19. So that's been a mix of market and affordable units, which is 28 affordable units and 8 market rent units. And it's really important, I think we've had that discussion at council before when we're looking at new housing developments, that it is a mix of people with affordable and also looking at market units. The Community Living Owen Sound and District have built 6 units of affordable housing, and they are housing with supports this year. 2018. Our home ownership program has provided a 5% down payment for 11 households in order for them to purchase a new home. Sometimes, the rent that people are paying is exactly what a mortgage payment would be, but they just don't have that initial 5% down payment. We also have our Ontario Renovates program, which allows people to stay in their house, which is very important. We might have a senior that just needs a new roof in order for their house to be, habitable for the next 10 years, and so this will often help towards that. We work with a number of community partners, such as Canadian Mental Health Association, Safe and Sound, Y Housing, to support some of the homelessness programs that we provide. We have a sustainable housing benefit that we administer through the county. We administered close to $500,000 last year for tenants or residents of Grey County so that they could remain housed. Last month's rent, utility arrears, rental arrears, sometimes it was helping them move to something more affordable if they could find that opportunity. We have a community enhancement fund which provides small grants to our community partners. We provided funding to a Giwi project through Mwekwadong Native Cultural Center, looking at that awareness of the services that we do provide and how can we make them more culturally safe and appropriate for people, Indigenous people. And we support an average of 70 tenants a month, 70 residents a month in transitional housing. And this is through our domiciliary hostels, or as they're now called, housing with related supports. And with that, we provided over 25,000 nights last year of people that needed that little bit of extra help, whether it's with medication, meals, in order for them to have sustainable housing. And we also directly operate our own housing, 997 units, and we have 9 nonprofits too that we also provide services to. So our next steps, as you're aware, we have an update coming to our 10-year housing and homelessness plan. We're at that 5-year mark. So we're going to be bringing forth some ideas on what we want to accomplish in the next 5 years so that we can provide a better support system for people that are experiencing homelessness. We can continue to promote and develop affordable housing, and we would love to continue to offer equal or better services that we provide right now. One thing that we did do is we put together a little bit of a video just so that you could have an idea and the public can have an idea of what we do. We always look in 3 different areas. We look at the people that we serve from a lens of a whole lens. So first of all, they need a place to live that's affordable, that's appropriate, that's safe. We need more of that housing, so that's that bricks and mortar part of it. But we also know that people that live with us need a little bit more than just bricks and mortar. So we look at that support part of it. How can we provide community supports coming in to help us? And in our video that we have for you, it's only 4.3 or 4.5 minutes long, is for looking at those services. So what services are we bringing into our resource centers, and the fact that we have 2 family resource centers. And then the next is those informal supports. How do we develop community within our buildings? And we do that by providing outreach workers and workers within our building that go around and encourage tenants to provide programming and whatnot on their own, and also bring in other programming. So before we wanted to recognize, I have Josh Gibson in the blue back here, who's our housing programs manager, and Jody, who also is our administrative assistant, who did a lot of work to get this video off the ground. I'd like to welcome you to Grey County recognizes that some of our tenants may need a little bit of help in order to live life to its fullest. Grey County has community relations workers that connect people with services in our community and also provide services on site. Grey County has 2 family resource centers, one located in Owen Sound and one in Meaford. The resource centers provide an opportunity for families to meet with services in order to assist them with some of their needs.
I like living here because of the people. I find them friendly, kind, caring. They kind of look after each other, and that's important. And I like my surroundings. It's beautiful here. We have trees. I have my own front porch. I could sit and watch the world go by. It's beautiful. The unit meets my needs in that it's all on one level. I have a walk-in shower. I could not get into a regular climb over the edge of the tub bathroom. Everything's at a good height for me. It's just all good. Out my back door, I have a small patio, and I can have my coffee out there on a summer's day. I foresee this becoming a very close-knit community because people are kind and caring. It's well lit, so if you want to go for a walk at night, you can. It's quiet. Once in a while I hear the children at school, and that's nice. So I think people will look after each other. And I think that's important, especially as you age.
My role here at the Family Resource Center is event coordinator for Grey County Housing. I do a lot of advocacy work for the community outside of the Resource Center. And I started volunteering at the Resource Center, so just seeing my hard work paying off and being offered a position really means a lot. What I do here is I plan events for the families, for the community here. The Resource Center means a lot. When you live in low income, you're isolated a lot, so the Resource Center offers programs where families can get together, they can meet other families that are in the similar situations, and just have a connection, friendships, bonds. What I find rewarding working at the Resource Center is knowing that my hard work is being paid off. The connections that people are making, they might not go outside their house to talk to their neighbor, but when they come here, they bond, and they realize they're not alone, and there's people living here in the same situations. So there's more friendship and just a sense of belonging in your community.
My role is to work in 5 Grey County housing buildings in Owen Sound. That's grown to work in outlying areas as well too. But to work with the tenants to basically to enhance their well-being in each building and to build community. So even though the term is community development worker, really a lot of it is reliant on the tenants taking some role in their own environment and some ownership of their own space. Started the place of inviting the tenants to come up with ideas of what they would think would enhance their lives. So, and I try to get the tenants involved in every stage to promote the events, to invite their neighbors, to clean up, set up, etc. I guess it should be obvious, but I think sometimes it isn't. I think community is important because people need people. And I think that part of their life is more than just living in their apartments. It branches out into a larger place, which could be in their own building, it could be in the streets around them. But I think the feeling of home is also what becomes community for people.
So that is my report. If anyone has any questions on the report on what we've been doing over the last year, I'd be happy to answer.
Councillor Dobreen.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Through you, the Ontario Renovates program, with regard to secondary suites that may assist aging at home or someone who may need a little extra income, would a homeowner qualify for that program? Possibly?
Yes, we do have a secondary suite program that's on our website through the Ontario Renovates. So it's not the homeowner itself, it's what you're doing with the unit itself. So it would have to go towards somebody that was under a certain income limit. So, yeah.
Timmy?
So just to clarify, would that be destined for a caregiver, an in-home caregiver, or for an income-generating opportunity to help them stay in their own home?
It could be both.
Okay.
It could be both.
Thank you.
Councillor Bartnicki.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. I want to commend you and whoever helped with the film. I think it was a very lovely, very positive look at community housing, and I would love to see it posted on all our individual municipal websites where they do exist, because I think it changes the public perception quite a bit. Thank you for that.
That's a good idea. Call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Thank you very much. All right. Item G, power transmission. Oh, sorry, I missed the, oh, right, yeah, sorry. I saw Anne, and you're still standing there. That should have been my, my apologies. Okay, could I get a mover, please? Councillor Robinson, seconded by Councillor Hutchinson. Anne Marie.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. So this is just a report to give you our first impressions and ideas of what's happening with the Ontario Community Housing Renewal Strategy. This strategy was, or is, part of the province's multi-year plan that aims to increase affordable housing, improve access, and ensure there's value for money. Currently, right now, we have an investment in affordable housing program that we run. A lot of the programs that I just spoke to you about, our homeownership program, our renovation program, our build program. That was part of our previous government, and now this government is introducing 3 new programs. The province signed a bilateral agreement with Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation within the National Housing Strategy in order to provide the funding through the 9 years of funding that's available through the National Housing Strategy. The funding is in 3 separate years, three-year periods, and so far we have information on what the first 3 years are going to look like. The first is a new program, and this is the Canada Ontario Community Housing Initiative, or otherwise known as COCHI. It is for community housing only, and community housing is defined as affordable housing, nonprofit housing, and our own social housing. The fund that they've developed is to protect community housing units where agreements are ending. So any of our nonprofits that provide housing to us will have an agreement that's going to be ending within the next 3 to 10 years. That was the original 30 or 35-year mortgage that they would have entered into at that time. At that time, we'll have to negotiate with them a new agreement, and obviously we want to keep as many rent-geared to income units and affordable units as we can. So this funding is to go towards mitigating that, and it's also to go towards our nonprofits. So if you look on, I'm sorry, I don't know what page it is, but the next page of my report, you'll notice the funding allocation that Gray received for 2019 is $10,627, and that is to go towards funding and renewal of existing community housing, so all of our housing that are nonprofits. As part of this program, we are to meet with all of our nonprofits and discuss what their capital needs might be and what their needs might be moving forward in order to sustain and ensure that they continue to fund community housing. So that I will be coming back to you with another report on what we plan to do with these funds once we receive a transfer payment agreement and we digest what we can do with our $10,000. So the next is the Ontario Priorities Housing Initiative, or OPI, and it is to address local housing priorities also, such as a lot of the programs that we did run. So this is our investment in affordable housing program, formerly our home ownership, our Ontario Renovates, our rent supplement. They've also added in that we can use it for community supports, which is excellent because we know that community supports are well needed in order for people to remain housed and housed well and live life to their fullest. if you look down at the previous funding allocation through the Investment in Affordable Housing Program, we received about 1.6 million over the past 2016, 17, 18. It's about an average of that. And with that, we were able to develop those 56 units of affordable and market housing. We've been able to help many people through our housing home ownership program, our Ontario Renovates program, and we also provide a rent supplement to people, to private landlords right now, which keep people housed. So if I have a senior that's living in an apartment that's $800 and 30% of their income is maybe $600, then that $200 keeps them housed and you know, gives them a little bit of extra spending money. So we have significantly, we did receive our funding amounts and they have been cut significantly. 2019, not as bad. We had from our previous program in investment in affordable housing, $431,000, and our under the OPI, we're receiving about $723,000. So we have about $1.1 million for 2019 to help us build, to help us run all of our programs. Next year, we received $374,000 compared to the $1.6 million. Significant decrease for us, and obviously we're not going to be able to run all of those programs. So I will be coming back to you with some sort of plan as to what we can do with the funding that we are receiving and maybe some ideas of what we might be able to do as a county to help out. Some of the programs that so we are in a housing crisis, so I think it's just disheartening to not be able to continue with our process of wanting to build at least 50 to 60 units every 3 years. If we can, we provide and find some other ways to do that, we will. But certainly, not only do we need, do people need money for housing, but we need more stock. We do have a very low vacancy rate, and I think that's one of our issues. So we'll certainly be coming with ideas around that and ideas for our 10-year housing and homelessness plan. The other program that we had that they are mentioning is a Canada-Ontario housing benefit. There's been very little information as to what this looks like right now. They have confirmed that they are negotiating with CMHC and that it is set to launch April 2020. From what I'm hearing, it's not a benefit that you would automatically get like a tax break. It is something that you would, a family or an individual would have to apply for. Along with I'm trying to get used to the new names now too, our Ontario Community Housing Renewal Strategy came some amendments, regulatory amendments to the Housing Services Act. The first amendment that they're looking at is simplifying the rent geared to income rules. It is very difficult to try and figure out someone's rent because of all the information that we have to get with whatever, with their income, investments, savings account, what they own, all that kind of stuff. So going to a tax-based system is actually quite a great idea, and we're actually excited about that part of it. The only concern that we do have is not everybody does file taxes. Councillor Desai did have a good question for me. Does that mean that they would be ineligible? I can't see them putting that into the legislation or regulations, and certainly that's not something we would want to see. My thought is we would probably have to do rent the old way until they did file their taxes. We encourage people to file their taxes. We even have volunteer tax clinics at some of our buildings and provide information to it, because there's always HST rebates or some of those little things that people can get to help them out when they do file. Improving our wait lists. This is another regulation change. Right now, someone can go on our wait list and they can put on for all of Grey County. So they might put themselves on every building in Grey County, and they would have 3 refusals. So if we call somebody up and say, would you like to live in Durham? And they're like, I'm sorry, but all my supports are in Ontario or in Owen Sound, then they can turn that down. A bit of a waste of time because there is a process to go through that offering, trying to get in touch with the person, waiting that amount of time, and then if they do decide to turn it down. This right now is limiting in some ways, in fact, that they're saying it's one offer. If you don't, you go to the bottom of the list. So what the aim to do is to help prioritize housing for those that need it the most. And I guess as service managers, sometimes we kind of shake our heads when we're down to the 12th person on the list that we're offering a vacant unit to. But at the same time, I understand that it's a very complex system and that maybe it's not that person's fault that they're not ready for housing at that time. So what they are doing is they're allowing the service manager to come up with exceptions as to why you would not count that as an offer, and they wouldn't go to the bottom of the list. If, for example, hospitalization might be one, health issues, unable to move at the time, changes in daycare, or something that they haven't reported to us. Right now, we do try and get through our wait list every 6 months to get current information. If we can't contact people, if they've changed their phone number or whatnot, then we can't make that offer. So we do make that effort right now, so we will certainly continue with that. And also too, on our end, maybe that focus in that we spend in trying to contact people and provide information about that unit can go up front, where we'll be able to sit down with that person and say, okay, where would you like to live? Really, you're going to get one opportunity. You live in Hanover, your supports are in Hanover, your doctor's in Hanover. Probably the buildings in Hanover is where you should be looking at rather than Dundalk or whatnot, right? So it'll give us some time to really help people make those better choices, I think. And the last one is creating safer communities. Previously, we cannot refuse someone housing. So if we had a person in our housing that we had evicted because of a serious illegal activity, we would have to accept that person back into our buildings or into our housing, which does create some issues. This proposed change allows service manager some ability to reduce some of that reoccurrent crime. Fortunately, in Grey County, we don't have as many incidences of serious violence or crime, but it is a good tool for us. Of course, there was nothing in there to define what a serious illegal activity is, so that's something that we would be looking for guidance or information for, or whether that's up to the service manager to make that decision. And that's my report, if you have any questions.
Questions, anyone? Councillor Mackey?
When would you like to help with the serious illegal activity criteria?
We have to wait till the regulatory comes out. We'll certainly be adding that into our report.
Are you offering to help with some serious illegal activity?
More than happy to give a hand for my thoughts.
Councillor McQueen, did you have a question? I saw your hand go up that way, okay. I call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? That too is carried. Thank you. Now I can go to G. Is it Scott? Yeah. Okay, looking for a mover, please. Councillor Milne, seconded by Councillor Hutchinson.
Great, thanks Warden Hicks and members of council. What we have before us is a relatively straightforward agreement to look at a crossing of our county CP rail lands with both a driveway, they're calling it an access road, and an above ground hydro line. The lands are shown up there in blue. They gain access off of Highway 10. They're just sort of southeast of Berkeley, so they're in the greater Berkeley area. And the property is bisected right now by the CP rail line. This line is, as you might know, used as a trail, multi-use trail with both motorized and non-motorized users. The proponents would like to install a small solar array on either side of the CP rail line. The solar panels would be fenced, so there would be no access for people using the trail, but they would need an access road going across the trail, and they would have a hydro line crossing the trail. The hydro line would be designed such that it's no lower than 7 meters above the trail, so that things like grooming equipment or any maintenance equipment on the trail will still be able to be outfitted there. The actual construction of the solar panels will be the largest activity in terms of people crossing the trail. Beyond that, there'd be occasionally people crossing for maintenance, but generally speaking, once they're installed, there's not a lot to do there. Some returning members of County Council may remember that we had a similar such agreement about halfway through last year for a property in the city of Owen Sound with a company called Grasshopper Solar. They're also working on this project. The actual agreement itself would be with Egerton Solar Power, but the agreement itself would be very similar. The agreement was originally drawn up last year, shortly after that Grasshopper agreement, by our county solicitor at the time, Errol Treslin. Since then, Michael Letourneau, our Director of Legal Services, and Lacey Thompson have both put a significant amount of time into tweaking the agreement and making sure that it's the best that it can be, such that it protects the county. There's provisions in the agreement such that it limits our liability, but also protects us should we ever need to use the trail for other purposes. Namely, should rail ever return to Grey County, we would still have that ability. There's many situations across the county right now where people have existing driveways crossing the trail. In some cases, those predate the county's ownership of the trail. So this really would be very similar, other than we will have the hydro line as well. We'll still have the ability to use the trail for both trail purposes and as an infrastructure corridor, as we do in different parts of the county. As such, staff are recommending that the report be received and that a bylaw be prepared for County Council at its next session to adopt the agreement. That's the Coles notes. I'd certainly be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Councillor Milne?
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Scott, was there any consideration given to the proponent boring the hydro line under the track?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Warden. That's a good question. We did talk to them about that. It was going to be significantly more expensive to the point where it didn't make it feasible on their end. From a pure trail perspective, that's, you know, the greatest benefit to the county is to have it underneath rather than over top, but it wasn't feasible on the developer's end at this stage.
All right, I call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried, thank you.
Thank you.
Back now to item 6A, I believe, right? 6A. Charges, Kevin. Let me find it. I got it here. Should I know?
Yep, you should get
Yeah, so let's get it on the floor. Can I get a mover, please? Councillor Desai, seconded by Councillor Bartnicki. All right, Councillor Desai, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Warden. My question on this report is it's more of a philosophical question. Having seen changes to that are in Bill 108, on whether or not we should be petitioning the province to allow municipalities to take development charges into general revenues, so that we may actually plan for the future, and so that we can use development charges that in a proactive fashion rather than a reactive fashion, and only use them once we've had the development come in. And I wanted to ask that question through you to staff.
My comment on that is that I think the history of development charges are that at one time the building community was getting asked to fund capital projects for a municipality, and then there was the feeling that one developer maybe got preferential treatment over another developer. So the Development Charges Act was here's a mechanism that we're going to calculate what those growth costs are, and then when a developer comes along or someone building a home, they're all paying the same amount of money. And then, so with that, then it's, though that background study details what you're collecting that for, what growth-related project that is to pay for. So keeping it in an obligatory reserve protects that's what it gets used for. If you move that over to general reserves, then that could be at the whim of a council to spend it on whatever. So I think the background of this and why that was done was this way was what the development community had asked for. So.
Good. Any other questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Thank you. Item 5B, the letter from the Ontario Good Roads Association. I guess I need to put that on the floor as well. Mover, please. Councillor Milne, seconded by Councillor McQueen. So you had a question?
So a bit of background on this. so the correspondence, as you saw, was prior to the most recent OGRA conference. The board voted to send a letter to the Roma board to invite them back to the table to discuss getting the two conferences back together. And you've seen the Roma board basically denied that request and said that they didn't want much to do with it. Grey Highlands Council at their May 15th meeting passed a motion that basically asks the Roma board to reconsider their position on that. And my intention was to have that motion be discussed by this council so that we can send a similar motion to the board of directors for Roma so that we can have an annual Roma combined.
So further to that, I have reached out to the clerk's department in Grey Highlands and asked them to provide me with that motion, and we will include it then on the next council agenda.
Essentially a notice of motion?
No, it's not. It'll just be on the consent agenda.
Gotcha. Right. Okay, any other, Councillor Milne?
Thank you, Mr. Warden, and I would certainly support Doctor of Philosophy Desai's attempts to get Roma to reconsider, because I think, thinking back, the combined conference did give us a lot better value for our time than the two separate conferences. Although they are good conferences, I think it's much better if they're together.
Agree.
I am honored.
Councillor Soever.
I would echo that. It'd be better if the two conferences were together, then we'd only have to hear Akash sing the Lobsterman song twice a year.
Councillor DeBreen.
I'll try, through the warden. Mr. Warden, would it be possible for our good colleagues across the room to circulate that resolution to all of the municipalities in Grey County so that we too might be able to support their resolution?
Thank you, Councillor Dobreen. I believe staff was directed to do it. I'll double check on that and make sure it gets out to all.
Okay, we're getting silly. It's the end of the day. All those in favor? Any opposed? That too is carried. One last motion. Why don't we go with Councillor, I'm looking right at him, Thompson?
Any notices of motion?
Oh, yes, sorry. Any notices of motion? My apologies. None. Councillor Thompson, yeah. Yeah. Do I need a seconder?
Yes, you do.
I need a seconder, yeah. Councillor Milne. All those in favor? Any opposed? It's carried. Thank you very much, folks.